On May 14, 1948, in a modest art museum turned assembly hall in Tel Aviv, David Ben-Gurion stood before a small crowd of Jewish leaders, his voice steady but urgent. At 4 p.m, he read the Declaration of Independence, proclaiming the birth of the State of Israel. The room erupted in applause, but outside, the streets of Tel Aviv were alive with a raw, almost disbelieving joy. Men and women, young and old, danced in circles, wept openly, and embraced strangers. For the first time in nearly 2,000 years, since the Romans destroyed the Second Temple in 70 AD, the Jewish people, the indigenous people of the land, with a continuous historical and biblical connection stretching back to Abraham, Moses, and King David, had a nation to call their own once again, reborn through legal rights affirmed by the League of Nations and the United Nations. Yet even as the celebrations began, the shadow of war loomed. Arab armies from Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq were massing at Israel's borders, poised to invade the moment the British mandate expired at midnight. The new state was a fragile patchwork of Jewish settlements, poorly armed, outnumbered, and surrounded. Its survival hung by a thread. Half a world away, in Washington, D.C., another drama was unfolding, one that would shape Israel's fate. As Ben-Gurion spoke, the world waited to see what the United States, the emerging superpower of the post-World War II era, would do. Would it recognize this fledgling Jewish state, or would it leave Israel to face its enemies alone? Inside the White House, the decision was far from certain. President Harry S. Truman, a plain-spoken man from Missouri, faced a storm of opposition from his most trusted advisors. The State Department, the Pentagon, and even the revered Secretary of State George C. Marshall warned that recognizing Israel would be a disaster. It could alienate the Arab world, threaten America's access to Middle Eastern oil, and push the region into the Soviet Union's orbit at the dawn of the Cold War. Marshall, a towering figure in American politics, was so vehemently opposed that he threatened to resign, and even vowed to vote against Truman in the 1948 election if the president moved forward. But against these formidable odds, Truman made a historic choice. Just 11 minutes after Ben-Gurion's declaration, at 6:11 p.m. Eastern Time, the United States became the first nation to recognize the State of Israel. That decision granted Israel instant legitimacy, a lifeline in its most vulnerable moment, and played a critical role in the destiny of the Jewish people. How did this moment come to pass? The answer lies in a deeply personal story, a clash of wills within the Oval Office, the moral weight of the Holocaust, the quiet influence of an unlikely Jewish haberdasher from Missouri, and a president who saw himself as an instrument of history. This is the untold story of how Harry Truman, almost alone, played a key role in the fate of Israel in its first 11 minutes of existence. Harry S. Truman was an unlikely president. Born in 1884 in rural Missouri, he was a farmer's son with no elite education or powerful connections. His early life was marked by struggle, a failed haberdashery business in Kansas City, debts that lingered for years, and a modest career in local politics. Yet through grit and determination, Truman climbed the ranks, becoming a US Senator and in 1944, Franklin D. Roosevelt's Vice President. When FDR died suddenly in April 1945, Truman was thrust into the presidency at one of the most tumultuous moments in history. World War II was nearing its end, and Truman faced staggering responsibilities, authorizing the use of the atomic bomb on Japan, navigating the Potsdam Conference with Stalin and Churchill, and laying the foundations for the Cold War. He also oversaw the creation of the United Nations, a new institution meant to prevent another global conflict. Truman was no polished statesman. He spoke plainly, often bluntly, and valued loyalty and principle over political gamesmanship. His roots in the Bible Belt shaped his worldview. As a boy, he had read the Bible cover to cover multiple times, memorizing passages about Abraham, Moses, and the prophets. To Truman, the Jewish people were not just a political issue, they were the children of Israel, a people whose ancient covenant with God resonated with his sense of justice. In a 1943 speech before he became president, Truman condemned the Nazi persecution of Jews, declaring, quote, "The Jews are entitled to their homeland." Later, as president, he reflected on the Bible's influence. Quote, "The fundamental basis of this nation's law was given to Moses on the Mount. If we don't have that fundamental basis, we are lost." For Truman, the question of a Jewish state was not merely geopolitical, it was a moral and even spiritual imperative, rooted in the survival of a people who had endured unimaginable suffering. Despite Truman's personal leanings, his administration was a fortress of opposition to recognizing Israel. At the forefront was George C. Marshall, the Secretary of State and one of the most respected figures in America. Marshall had been the Army Chief of Staff during World War II, orchestrating the Allied victory, and was now the architect of the Marshall Plan, a massive effort to rebuild Europe. Truman revered him, once saying, quote, "I never want to do anything unless George Marshall agrees with me." Marshall's stance was unequivocal. Recognizing Israel would be a strategic disaster. The Middle East held vast oil reserves critical to America's allies and the global economy. Arab states, many of which were emerging from colonial rule, controlled this oil and were fiercely opposed to a Jewish state. Marshall warned that recognition would alienate them, jeopardize US economic interests, and push the region toward the Soviet Union, which was eager to exploit any American misstep in the Cold War. The State Department reinforced Marshall's position. Loy Henderson, head of the Office of Near Eastern and African Affairs, argued that recognition would ignite endless conflict in the Middle East and harm America's reputation among Arab nations. The CIA issued dire predictions, estimating that Israel's poorly equipped forces would be overrun by Arab armies within weeks. The Pentagon, still weary from World War II, feared that supporting Israel could drag US troops into a new conflict at a time when America was demobilizing. Even domestic politics weighed against Truman. The 1948 election was approaching, and his advisors warned that recognizing Israel could alienate key constituencies, including oil companies and voters wary of foreign entanglements. The consensus in Washington was nearly unanimous. Recognizing Israel was a reckless gamble with little upside. On the other side, Jewish leaders and Zionist organizations were relentless in their advocacy. The Holocaust had ended just 3 years earlier, leaving 6 million Jews dead and hundreds of thousands of survivors languishing in displaced persons (DP) camps across Europe. These survivors, many of whom had lost their entire families, faced closed borders and uncertain futures. The promise of a Jewish homeland reborn offered a beacon of hope, a place where they could rebuild their lives with dignity. Zionist leaders like Rabbi Stephen Weiss and Abba Hillel Silver pressed Truman for support, meeting with him repeatedly. They spoke of the moral urgency of a Jewish state after the Holocaust and the practical need for a homeland to absorb refugees. Some appeals resonated with Truman's sense of justice. He was particularly moved by the report of the DP camps, where survivors lived in squalor, often behind barbed wire, but the constant lobbying also tested Truman's patience. Overwhelmed by the pressure, he once snapped to his staff, quote, "Jesus couldn't please them when he was here on Earth, so how could anyone expect me to have more success?" In early 1948, exasperated, he declared he would meet with no more Zionist leaders, fearing their demands were drowning out his ability to think clearly. The Zionist cause seemed to be losing ground as Truman dug in his heels. Enter Eddie Jacobson, an unassuming figure who would change the course of history. Jacobson was not a diplomat or a political heavyweight. He was a Jewish haberdasher from Kansas City, Missouri, who had served with Truman in World War I and later partnered with him in a men's clothing store. The business failed in the 1920s, leaving both men in debt, but their friendship endured, built on mutual trust and shared hardship. Jacobson was not a Zionist activist, nor was he deeply involved in Jewish politics. But in early 1948, as the debate over Israel's future reached a fever pitch, Zionist leaders approached him, knowing his unique access to Truman. They begged him to intervene, to use his personal connection to sway the president. In March 1948, Jacobson traveled to Washington and walked into the Oval Office. Truman was in a foul mood, still smarting from the barrage of Jewish lobbying. He told Jacobson bluntly that he would not see another Zionist, expecting his old friend to join the chorus of demands. But Jacobson took a different approach. He spoke not as a lobbyist, but as a friend. He reminded Truman of their shared history, the long nights in the haberdashery, the trust they had built. Then he pivoted to Truman's admiration for men of principle and courage. "Mr. President," Jacob said, "you have always had great admiration for men of courage. I know no greater man alive than Dr. Chaim Weizmann. All I ask is that you meet him." The room grew quiet. Jacobson's words cut through Truman's frustration. He wasn't asking for a policy debate. He was appealing to Truman's sense of loyalty and fairness. After a long pause, Truman relented. "All right, Eddie, I'll see him." Chaim Weizmann, the president of the World Zionist Organization, was a towering figure in the Jewish world. A renowned chemist and statesman, he had helped secure the 1917 Balfour Declaration, in which Britain endorsed a Jewish homeland. Now in his 70s, Weizmann was frail, nearly blind, and weakened by years of tireless advocacy, yet his intellect and moral authority remained unmatched. In March 1948, Weizmann met Truman in a private, unpublicized meeting at the White House. He did not come armed with charts or geopolitical arguments. Instead, he spoke from the heart, painting a vivid picture of a people who had survived the unimaginable. He described the Holocaust's devastation, entire communities wiped out, families torn apart, and the desperate plight of survivors in DP camps, yearning for a home. He spoke of the Jewish people's ancient connection to the land of Israel, a dream sustained through centuries of exile. Weizmann's words struck a chord. Truman, already sympathetic to the Jewish cause, was deeply moved by the elder statesman's sincerity and the moral weight of his plea. Later, Truman confided to aides that the meeting had shifted his perspective, reinforcing his belief that recognizing Israel was not just a political act, but a moral necessity. While his advisors spoke of oil and Cold War strategy, Weizmann spoke of survival, hope, and destiny. Despite Weizmann's impact, Truman's decision was not yet final. On May 12, 1948, just 2 days before Israel's declaration, the White House became a battleground. Truman convened a critical meeting with his top advisors, including George Marshall, Under Secretary of State Robert Lovett, and Clark Clifford, his young White House counsel. Clifford, a rising star in Truman's inner circle, took the lead in arguing for recognition. He framed it as both a moral and strategic imperative. After the Holocaust, he said, America had a responsibility to support the Jewish people's right to a homeland. He also argued that Israel, as a democracy in a region dominated by authoritarian regimes, would be a natural ally for the United States, countering Soviet influence in the long term. Marshall was furious. He saw Clifford's arguments as political posturing designed to win Jewish votes in the upcoming election. The room grew tense as Marshall, his voice icy, issued a stunning ultimatum. If you follow Clifford's advice, he said, and recognize the Jewish state, I will vote against you in the next election. The words hung in the air. For Marshall, the revered general who had guided America through World War II, to threaten political opposition was extraordinary. Truman respected Marshall deeply, and the threat carried weight. Yet, Truman remained calm, saying little. Inside, his resolve was hardening. He had heard Weizmann's plea, weighed the moral stakes, and considered the biblical resonance of a Jewish homeland. The showdown in the Oval Office only clarified his choice. Meanwhile, in Tel Aviv, the Jewish leadership faced their own moment of truth. The British Mandate, which had governed the land since 1920, was set to expire at midnight on May 14, 1948. The Jewish agency, led by Ben-Gurion, gathered to decide whether to declare independence. The risks were staggering. Arab armies were mobilizing, and American officials, including some in the State Department, had urged delay, warning that a premature declaration could lead to disaster. Inside the Jewish agency, opinions were divided. Some leaders feared that declaring statehood would provoke an immediate invasion, overwhelming Israel's makeshift army of volunteers and Holocaust survivors. Others, like Ben-Gurion, insisted that the moment was now or never. The United Nations had approved the partition of the land in November 1947, but without a formal declaration, the opportunity could slip away. On May 14th at 4 p.m, Ben-Gurion stood before a microphone in Tel Aviv's Independence Hall. Reading from a scroll, he declared the establishment of the State of Israel, invoking the Jewish people's historic and biblical connection to the land. The room burst into applause, and outside, crowds filled the streets, singing and dancing under the Mediterranean sun. Radios carried the news across the world, and Jews from New York to Buenos Aires wept with joy, but they also braced for war, knowing that Arab armies would attack within hours. The displacement of Arabs in 1948, often misattributed to Israel's establishment, stemmed not from Jewish settlement, rooted in legal purchases and international mandates, but from the genocidal war launched by Arab states on May 15th, aimed to annihilate the Jewish state and its people. Back in Washington, the White House was a flurry of activity. Truman had made his decision, but the timing was critical. As Ben-Gurion's voice echoed across the airwaves, Truman's aides prepared a brief statement, typed on plain White House stationery. At 6:11 p.m. Eastern Time, exactly 11 minutes after Ben-Gurion's declaration, Truman authorized its release. Quote, "The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel." With those simple words, America became the first nation to recognize Israel, granting it a vital stamp of international legitimacy. The decision was not without controversy. Some State Department officials were stunned, having expected Truman to waver under Marshall's pressure. But Truman's resolve held firm, driven by a blend of moral conviction, personal loyalty, and a vision of America's role in the world. Truman's decision reverberated across the globe. For Israel, US recognition was a lifeline. It signaled to the world that the Jewish state was not a fleeting experiment, but a recognized nation with the backing of a superpower. For Holocaust survivors in DP camps, it was a glimmer of hope, a promise that they could finally find a home. For Jews worldwide, it was a moment of vindication after centuries of persecution. The very next day, May the 15th, 1948, Arab armies invaded, launching Israel's War of Independence. Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq sent troops to crush the new state. Israel's forces, though outnumbered and under-equipped, fought with fierce determination, bolstered by the knowledge that they were now a recognized nation. The war would last nearly a year, costing thousands of lives, but Israel would emerge victorious, securing its survival. Truman's decision also reshaped US foreign policy. By aligning with Israel, America signaled its commitment to supporting democratic allies, even at the cost of strained relations with Arab states. The US-Israel relationship, forged in those 11 minutes, would become a cornerstone of American policy in the Middle East, enduring through decades of conflict and diplomacy. Years later, in 1956, Truman met with Jewish leaders in New York. They thanked him for his role in Israel's creation, calling him a hero of the Jewish people. Truman, ever modest, brushed off the praise, but one leader's words struck him deeply. Quote, "Mr. President, you will always be remembered as the man who helped create the state of Israel." Truman's eyes welled with tears. Quote, "I am Cyrus," he replied, invoking the ancient Persian king who in the 6th century BCE had allowed the Jews to return from exile and rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. Truman saw himself not as a hero, but as a humble instrument of history, guided by principle and providence to do what he believed was right. History is often shaped by fleeting moments, decisions made under pressure, voices that rise above the noise, and acts of courage that echo through time. In May 1948, the fate of a nation turned to an exhausted president from Missouri, a frail Jewish statesman who pleaded for his people, and a shopkeeper turned friend who knocked on the Oval Office door at just the right moment. In just 11 minutes, Harry Truman changed the course of Jewish history. His decision to recognize Israel was not just a political act, it was a moral stand, a declaration that the Jewish people, after centuries of exile and the horrors of the Holocaust, deserved a place back in their ancient homeland. That choice, made against the odds, remains one of the defining moments of the 20th century and a demonstration of the divine providence in Israel's unfolding story. I'm Ollie Annisfeld and you're watching JTV. A quick message before we finish. We have been lied to about the Palestinians from beginning till end. Have a watch of the trailer for our new documentary called The Invention of the Palestinians, How a Nation Was Invented to Destroy Another. And if you want to watch the full thing, just click on the link in the video description. The Palestinians. We have been told they are an ancient people fighting for their homeland which has been stolen from them. This narrative has fueled decades of conflict, painting Israel as an occupier of stolen land. But what if this identity is not of an ancient nation, but a modern, cynical invention? A political construct designed not to build a state, but to dismantle the Jewish one. In this JTV Plus documentary, we're going to uncover the truth behind the creation of the Palestinian identity. How it was forged in the fires of pan-Arabism, absent in historical records until strategically rebranded in the 1960s by leaders like Egyptian-born Yasser Arafat to rally global opposition against Israel. We'll trace its roots from the Ottoman era, where Palestine was a region without a distinct people, through the pre-1948 years of Arab rejectionism, before focusing on the pivotal shift of the 1960s, when Arafat declared we should now be known as Palestinians, inventing symbols like the flag to mask genocidal aims. This wasn't about self-determination, it was about exploiting refugees, suppressing true aspirations under Arab rule, and perpetuating a war to destroy Israel. Join us as we debunk the myths of an ancient Palestinian nation, expose the strategic manipulation, and reveal how this construct has hindered peace while fueling hate. Fair but firm, this is the story of an identity weaponized not for building a future, but for erasing one. To watch this JTV Plus documentary and access much more premium content, click on the link in the video description.